Okay, so what we're going to look at today is something I call intuitive pattern making. It's a way of looking at the fabric and kind of seeing what it is that it wants to do. Sometimes just taking the piece of cloth and wrapping it around the dress form and seeing where things might hang, what kind of drapes and folds you get just by how the fabric itself wants to hang. A lot of times you can just make little pinches to hold things together. I'm using pins right now to imagine that might be a seam or a set of buttons that would hold that together. And you can see just simply wrapping around and letting that extra fabric just fold out can make a really great design detail and gives the piece a lot of movement. Looking at that same piece of fabric, you can take it apart and fold it a different way. Now this is a piece of wool, so it does have a little bit of structure to it. It'll hold a fold pretty well, and it doesn't just totally drape, but it is a soft wool, so it drapes differently than if it were a heavy wool. So again, I start putting it around the dress form just to see how it wants to hang and fold. I find that since it holds some structure, it actually takes a pleat pretty well and makes a really smooth line over the shoulder. So I'm just working this in and seeing what happens if I pleat this in. Again, this is to give me some general ideas, and then once I decide what the structure is, I can create seams or understructures to hold the piece in place. I also like the edges on this piece and then those stripes on there, so if I can kind of play with where I make the folds, so those little lines that are on there can really kind of stand out and be part of the visual interest. So in this one, I'm going to try a little bit heavier fabric. This is actually an old shower curtain that's kind of just a plastic. And I find I wanted to do something that was a little bit more structured and not quite so fluid. And I'm putting that on the shoulder, but I found it was kind of still a little bit wimpy. But if I take the fabric and I fold it multiple times, I can get a much stronger line. I wanted something that would actually structurally change that shoulder and make the shoulders wider. So I folded it under 4 different times to make it strong enough, and now it actually holds itself up pretty well. And then I'm going to take a piece and put it around the sides, wrap it around, and just playing with where do I want that to go. Do I want it to be long, or maybe I'm going to shift it around and see how it hangs against the body. And again, every piece of fabric, every material you use will be different, and different things that you do to it will show up, will sort of make themselves evident. And again, that if you see that front edge is looking a little bit wimpy, so I'm going to go in on that and fold it in a few more times to make it secure so it's a lot stronger. That'll give it a nice crisp edge along the front, so it has a really strong kind of sculptural quality to the garment. And just for comparison, I'm going to take the same piece and take it apart and look at what happens if I only use a single layer. How heavy is that going to be if I just do one layer on there and not have the heavy folds in center front or on the shoulder. And now I'm going to try something different on the shoulder to get a different kind of a line. So I'm just folding up some fabric. Again, the folds give it structure so that as it starts to go up over the shoulder, it'll hold more shape and be more sculptural than if it's just a single sheet of fabric laying on its own. And again, I kind of like these marks and lines that are on there, so I'm looking at the pleats as a way to show off those little marks that are on there. And then to contrast that with like a fabric that's very drapey. So I want to start, this is a big piece of yardage, and I want to cut it into 2 pieces. So I have kind of 2 squares, so I'm measuring it in half. I'll make a little clip and then rip the piece in half to be able to have 2 squares to start with. So as I first put this on here, I'm going along with the grain of the fabric, and you can see how the fabric hangs kind of in a tube, very cylindrical, because I'm hanging it on the grain. So the grain is running up and down. I thought that I like kind of how edges flop together, so I'm going to actually put the seam in the center front and just using pins to hold it in there. So I'm just kind of looking at the fabric to see what it wants to do. It's very drapey, so automatically I kind of think it wants to make some drapes going down. So I'm pulling up and pinning it down to the dress form to make little pooches and shapes on it. So I'm just messing around with these drips to see what kind of shape I can get. Again, this is kind of a way to look at the direction that you want to go, and once you decide like what looks cool, then you can start thinking through construction of what has to happen to make the garment stay that way. And then if I wanted to hold it down in this place, I might make a tube underneath, maybe out of like a knit fabric that's just fit the body, and then excuse me, and then I would go in, and each place where I have a pin, I would actually stitch that outer fabric to the inside tube. And certainly on this rectangles and squares project, you don't want to get into really heavy duty construction. It's like, what can you do that's simple that still fits the way you want? So now I'm going to take that same piece of fabric and see what happens if I turn it on the bias. So instead of putting it on the body where you get this straight kind of tube, I'm going to pick it up and take it by the corner and pull the corner up in center front so that the fabric is hanging on the bias. As you can see, you just get a lot more drape and fullness and movement in the fabric just by turning it on the bias. So I'm going to hold the neckline in place with a different piece of fabric. Again, that's something I could maybe sew into place if I decide I want to leave that as part of the design. And then I just continue sort of fussing with the fabric, see where it wants to go, how it might want to lay, and look for something it's doing that's interesting, and figuring out how I can make that be a featured part of the design. Trick that's really nice if you want to adjust some fine tuning kind of at a waistband is to put a piece of elastic around the waist and just pin it into place, and then when you come back with your fabric, you can start tucking it into place, and whatever manipulations you do, the elastic will hold it there in place. It allows you to then go in and fine tune exactly where pleats are going to fit. Are they going to be pleats? Are they going to be gathered? Do you want it to be even across the waistband, or maybe asymmetrical and all happen on one side or another? And when you have some fabric in there and you just shift the angle that it's coming through that waistband, it changes quite a bit. So this little piece of elastic on the waistband is really great at helping you explore different opportunities and different things that might show up because of subtle differences in the angle or the overlap or the type of pleat or gather that you make. And then once you have that all set in place, so you know where it wants to be, you want to grab a piece of other fabric that you can either put underneath as a base that you don't see, or you can wrap it over the top to be a belt. And what you would do is you could like hand stitch or pin those into place. You could actually pattern this also, where you could draw a line right where that elastic band hits, and then that becomes your stitch line where you might attach it to a different part of a garment. But again, this holds it in place temporarily while you're finding the line you want for stitching or connecting, and then but you need to attach it to something else to make it stay there. And working similar but with a very different piece of fabric, this is also a sheer silk, and it's also hand painted, but this one is organza, and it has a lot more structure to it, a lot more crispness than the chiffon that you saw on the last piece. So you can see you can go around and adjust. The elastic again can hold these pieces in place while you're working. Or if I'm going for something, maybe I don't want something quite so full, I can work on pleats at the waist instead of those gathers and not be creating extra fullness coming from the vertical fullness from the shoulder to the waist, but pulling that straight so that it straightens it out, and then pleats. And so you can see the volume on this is much lower than on the other, where there's extra length from the shoulder to the waist, and also it's more gathered than pleated. So you can adjust the volume by how much extra fabric you're putting in, and then also the way that you pull that fabric, the way you constrict it back. A gather is almost always more full than a pleat.